Welcome everyone, Dr. Thor here. Get ready for Gnosis. Well, on my continuing research on the Process Church, there is, I should say, two interesting little novelizations from a person who claims to be one of the children, in the Process Church. He's written two novels, which is not something that I prefer. Beyond the Cabin and Finding Home. These can be obtained on Kindle for only $3 if you're interested. And this is this person's general, actual experience in the actual Process Church as a child and being part of one of their particular groups and what he actually went through. Now, the Process Church has, what from I can see at this particular point, a very unfounded reputation of being a horrible satanic murdering group, thanks to the incompetent researcher Maury Terry, who is blamed everything on the Process Church, which is just nonsense. There's virtually nothing that can trace the Process Church other than gossip, innuendo, and made-up conspiracy series that they actually had anything to do with anybody. They've tried to tie them into the Manson problems, which a book was written about that called The Family. They sued the author, and of course they had that chapter removed. They're an easy escape goat group because of the fact of their initial bizarre appearance, black robes, crosses with snakes on them. They really never used anything overly occult. They really weren't occultists. They were a Christian sect, otherwise known as a Gnostic sect, which believes in this unification of Jesus and Satan to cause peace. Now, this is an old thought with everyone. The combination of conflict within the right and left brain, the higher and lower self. So there's nothing odd about this. Now, they did a lot of odd stuff to attract attention. If they stand on the street corners in shorts and lacrosse shirts, what, you going to get anywhere? Or T-shirts and jeans? Well, they had to put on a show. They also had German Shepherd dogs. And so many things have been linked to them, it's just absurd. But there's never been, as far as I know, there's certainly never been anybody in the upper church that was ever convicted of any crime or even arrested. Now, there may be some members or so-called members who did illegal acts, and the prisons are filled with people that are members of something, churches, Mormons, etc., Scientology, all these people. But that doesn't mean that the organization itself condoned that. And the fact that they were where a lot of negative things happened, well, they were everywhere where the action happened. Now, there just is nothing tracing them. There's just basically gossip. And some people have stated that there were representatives of the Process Church were involved in some of this satanic cult that is involved with the Son of Sand. So all of that, and just because somebody shows up there and claims they work with the Process Church or even are involved in one way or another with illegal activities or is there as a, quote, rep, means absolutely nothing. It doesn't mean that they participate or what's going on, etc. So there is a mystery about them because of their strange beliefs and their, in general, bizarre leadership, which really hurt the organization by Mary Ann, one of the founders, with Robert Moore, who put together all of these things and built it. And all of it really seems to be the problem that we have with what's going on in general of getting vaccinated. We have no legitimate reporters or investigators out there. It's all about making things sexy, sensational, to sell product because that's what they're doing. Now, I understand that, but the basic casualty when that happens is truth. So people stretch things, they put in unfounded information to make the story more, quote, sexy, and we run into all sorts of problems when that happens. But the entire world is a whore, and they want to get your attention. We've seen that recently with information that has come out about the death of comedian actor Bob Saget at the time of this recording, and it was tried and made into the fact that he was murdered when it was just untrue. We go on and on with this of making things more interesting. There's been several books out on the Process Church written by members, high-ranking members and leadership in the recent years. Most of them have now passed. Mary Ann, one of the main founders, is dead. Robert de Grimston, Robert Moore, is 86, now living in apparently Sarasota, Florida. He spent the last years since all this went on apparently on Staten Island. So it wasn't hard to find this guy, and certainly has never been linked to or arrested for anything else. We have Timothy Wiley, who died a few years ago, who wrote a big book on the Process Church, which I think is the definitive guide, showing some of their abuses, showing their organization, which I look at as a classic cult. And this book gets to that classic cult as well. Now, it's amazing how cults are started to be alternative and change the world and make things better. And what usually happens is the horrendous treatment of children. I mean, Scientology is a plain example of that. I'm not sure why treating children horribly is going to assist your organization. Now, they're trying to isolate the children from the parents so that they can basically get them totally, completely involved in assisting the organization and assisting them with money. That's what all of these cults apparently do. Seems to me that that's poor planning, but it does take care of the situation of controlling the person who really you are benefiting from, which is the adults and their money and their direct activities. Children, as we all know, particularly human children, are basically helpless until they're 6, 7, 10 years old. And of course, you have no legal rights until you're 18. So it's difficult, but I guess you could use children in other ways in terms of labor, etc. But they drain a lot of money. This is just the facts of it. Now, people look at this in bad ways, but that's the reality. If you're running a cult trying to survive, which is what most of these cults have problems doing, and getting everybody out there working. So having a bunch of children around certainly is not helpful with the care that's required, the money that's required, etc. So in general, just looking at it in that way, they are abused. Where it goes past that is unknown. Certainly there's a horrific story of how the church in Chicago, which he was born into, horribly abused children. Some think even directly, which never been proven, but and the fact that they weren't given any money for anything. And newborn babies, while the founders of that church, Mary Ann and Robert, were living in the lap of luxury in big townhouses or mansions in New York City and other places, the actual nursery, you could call it, which had several children in it, was given virtually no money at all. They didn't even have money to feed the children. Now, why people would stay there, I have no idea, but this is what's been alleged against them, and I tend to think that this kind of abuse of total lack of caring about the children tends to be true. Most of these places are like that. I mean, the kind of horrific stories that have been alleged against Scientology and their abuse of adults and everyone else certainly leads to this type of things. All these cults separate the children from their parents. There's been horrendous stories that came out about the Hare Krishnas abusing children, having death squads, etc. Who knows? But when you get these groups together that don't have any income, they basically have to make money, and a bunch of bored people, by the way. They have to make money by going out there and begging. Now, this is, of course, a tradition with the Eastern religions. I mean, that's what the Buddhists do, is that they go out and beg during the day to get donations. So this is a real problem when you've set up your society that way. So what does Jarrett Nathan Garrett, as I said, that's his full name. You can find his Beyond the Cabin on Amazon. It's, as I said, available in Kindle for $3. But if you want to be a researcher, you have to be very well read. If you're investigating an organization, you need to read whatever's been put out there, even though you have to fully understand that most likely there are huge gaps, inconsistencies, and things are put out there the way that people want the impression of that to be done. Now, this is an interesting guy. I think what he states here is pretty right. I do think there's a cover-up here of maybe something worse going on, but it's hard to say. He has no intentions. He still, I think, knows people in the organization. And he states that at the end of his book, that he's not looking for retribution. He's not looking to trash anybody. And that generally means that you weren't that abused. And I don't think there was that much abuse here in terms of what we're talking about directly. Things like violence past a certain level. He claims he was horribly beat up at one time. And I tend to think that that is something that he put in there to make the story more sexy. He was claimed to have been spanked many, many times, apparently. And this was common back in those days anyway. But he really only cites one instance, and only himself, who was abused by someone else who beat him up, apparently seriously, where he was hurt for quite a period of time. Well, I don't know if that's true or not. Discipline of this type is common, especially with conservative Christians. The fact that the children were put together, he didn't know who his parent was. A lot of this seems to be a conflict of him trying to find his parents, not the fact that the actual cult was that bad or that he was subjected to bad things, but he felt completely isolated, not knowing his parents, not knowing his mother, not knowing where he came from, and being in a non-productive environment. Now, they were schooled pretty well, from what he states, and that the actual schooling was excellent. The fact that he only had friends and wasn't sure who his mother was and all this stuff is what seems to be the conflict here. And certainly that seems to be a problem, and that brings up a bigger issue of, group the group raising children, which has been something that's done a long time. There's also been in a lot of organizations, they encourage promiscuous sex, so nobody really knows who that child really is. And they do this mostly to foster what's the opposite apparently happens, is that everybody takes care of the children better because nobody really knows who their parents are. So this is an old thing. This is done in Japan in particular, in their bathhouse culture, which had a lot of sexuality involved in it, where nobody in the village who used that bathhouse was 100% sure whose child that was. And of course, in racially restricted areas like Japan, well, how can you tell if one person looks that much different than another? So the whole idea is that this was a technique that is done and obviously doesn't do well. So he was in conflict. They were forced to go out and begging every day, which he despised. I would assume everybody would despise that. You have to go out and beg. This is certainly not a good position to begin. A lot of this isn't overly covered. He certainly didn't like that. He didn't like the belief systems of the actual church as well. Well, this is kind of common. And as you're getting into your teens, which is what we're talking about here, you tend to question, and rightfully so, what is this structure that I'm living in all about? And that's exactly what he did. So this is basically a novel, which I despise. I just hate novelizations of facts because you can really twist everything and get away with it. And he states that he has. He has twisted the story. He's changed names because he wants to keep things fairly clean here. As an individual, he did escape from this cult, apparently found his parents, and now he is a Mormon with 8 children living in, I believe, Salt Lake City, working directly or indirectly for the church, which is how the Mormons work and how they have grown. So all that's kind of exciting when we look at it all of what this person has done. He is now an author of many sci-fi type books as well. You can find those all there if you want. Typically clean written Mormon type sci-fi adventures. as well as his two novelizations of his experiences. So the first book here takes him from, it's kind of like, when I was reading it, I was feeling like this is an escape from prison novel. You know, he's got a place to go to, he's hoarding clothes and food so he can go out. And of course, book 2, I believe, is his process, because this takes him to getting out of the cult to this place that he can then live for a little while. The next book, I believe, is him finding his parents and this journey as well. It's a very personal fictionalization. It goes a lot into how he's feeling, what he's doing, and very little substance in terms of what the actual organization is. He talks about the different rituals they were having in terms of the Christian masses and other things that were there. So it talks a lot about that. It talks about their that, and it talks a little bit about their philosophy, but most of it is how he is feeling, how he's relating to the other children. So there really is nothing in this book whatsoever that will give you any enlightenment to the Process Church and what their practices were. This is a typical cold cult. That's what all these cold cults are about. As I said, I don't quite understand this, but they're all ran like that I am familiar with. I've never read about a cult who took care of their children properly. As I said, I just don't get this. He doesn't cite any kind of sexual abuse other than violent abuse against the children and the physical discipline that went on, which was very common in that time. So there's nothing in here. He doesn't know really anything about the rituals that were done. He talks about them having prayer meetings and all the other things in a very typical Christian way of doing things. So there's absolutely no statements about Satanism, about any of that, which he has stated in a radio interview. This was a very common cult, and they were cold and distant, and they were begging for money. That's how they raised money. They would go out and do that, and he despised this. It's not the fact that he despised anything because of ferocious trauma that he went through other than being physically abused, which I think a lot of people have been. Now, to what level, who knows? And to what level that is leaving a scar, I don't know. People have been spanked and disciplined in a physical manner for hundreds of years. I'm not sure whether that's necessarily hurt anybody. But the fact is that anybody, and it was common practice through the 60s into the 70s, that you spanked children. Now, if you're beating people up, well, that's inappropriate everywhere, obviously. And a lot of that goes on between adults as well. But, you know, your school system allows that. Bullies beat you and get in fights, and there's nothing done about it. Instead of those children who perpetrate this should be arrested. So the whole idea is all of this is a little bit overdone if you're looking in that area, because we're not talking about constant, severe corporal punishment where people were hurt and terribly abused. So it doesn't seem to be any of that. There's no talk of any kind of sexual abuse. There's no talk of satanic rituals. None of that stuff is the bottom line of that's happened. So you got to remember, this really is not a satanic cult. What it is a Christian cult, and Satanism is a reverse Christianity. They use Christian symbols. It has absolutely nothing to do with occultism. That's another fallacy that people can't get their head over. They somehow think this is some sort of common witchcraft type practices, which just isn't true. It's a reverse Christianity, and Christianity gave birth to Satanism. It's as plain as simple. But there's nothing talked about that. There's no clues of what was going on with this whatsoever. There is a couple of little things, and of course, this is what you're looking for as a researcher. Apparently, in his fictionalized version, some member of the church was a drug addict, a heroin addict, and was selling drugs on the street as part of it. Well, that shows me that they were involved in criminal activity. There's talk of guns. Well, again, what's that all about? So the whole idea, and apparently this addicted member was murdered on the street. So he was shot by someone on the street. So these are all the things that we have to say, well, what's going on here? So they're on the street begging, supposedly, but we got one guy who is a heroin addict who eventually is killed on the street by another criminal. So he had to raise money somehow. How was he raising money to get his heroin? And was that done from donations that he took to do that? And of course, he's in with a bad group of people selling drugs. Well, here's another connection, which I always find interesting, but how much credit can we give that? There's the same question I've had in the other books on the process church, is there's an allusion to other process group homes that nobody knows about. Well, why don't you know about those? Are they up to illegal activity? And here's a church that, why was this person tolerated to be a drug addict and then eventually being murdered on the street? And this is all part of what's going on with the entire process that's going on here with researching things. So that's what you're looking for as a researcher, trying to read between the lines. But there certainly is nothing here that insinuates child abuse in terms of sexual, and there certainly is no talk of any kind of satanic rituals going on. In any way whatsoever. They're doing typical Christian services and reading from the Bible, etc. That's all part of what goes on in these types of organizations, which is very common. As I've mentioned, the horrible separation and abuse has been alleged against the Church of Scientology, where they take their children away and isolate them so they can manipulate the adults. Horrible things have been said about the Hare Krishnas. I don't know if they're correct or not. Again, it's been alleged they've even had people with murder groups out there, and huge amounts of sexual abuse has been alleged against the Hare Krishnas. And we've got all the other groups out there that we know to a large extent, and has been documented much better, are up to all sorts of shenanigans and bad practices. Yet for some reason, this is being stuck in people's minds because they are, quote, Satanists, which they are not Satanists. And they never have used occult symbols. They never used the pentagram. They never used any upside down crosses, etc. They did use the goat's head, apparently, symbolizing Satan and Lucifer, which are all basic Christian symbols. They had their own little bizarre cross that kind of looks swastika-like, and I'm not sure why they did that, except to trigger people. All of these things they did, and of course they used crosses with a snake in it, representing the unification of Satan and Christ. And again, this is looked at as, oh, how terrible that is. It's not a worship of Satan. It's a worship of the lower and higher self, which makes a lot of sense. This is in conflict. We have a world that is good and evil is fighting. We've got to come to some sort of conclusion here and understand that mankind has a lot of evil in him, instead of thinking that we're going to ignore this and just go down this other path, which is what's been going on for a couple of thousand years now since Christianity and so many other religions. That's not working, and it will never work. So the philosophy of the Process Church, which has gone through many different reincarnations. They started off as this Scientology group where Marianne and Robert were completely and totally trained in. They were high levels in their auditors, and they broke away and took all of their technologies, including their e-meter, and used it for themselves, what they consider in a better way. Well, I have a feeling they considered it in a money way. This is a way they could make money. They didn't like the Church of Scientology because they weren't getting any money. That's my conclusion of that. They broke off with that. They started their own little group. They had their own ideas. Now, what all that and what it believes in is hard to say. They have, as I said, people label them as satanic when the belief system is very Gnostic, very much of understanding that the physical world has no value. And of course, they're demonized. But, the bottom line is that Christianity demonizes everybody. The Mormons, the Catholics, they're all demons. They're all praying to Satan. I've heard this 100 times. It goes back thousands of years that anytime some other group was criticized, they were all baby killers and all these things. But we have been able to track this, certainly, while I don't think anybody in this particular area, in this particular spot, we don't know what's going on other places. And there are different branches of and different houses that were involved in this. So the whole idea is I don't believe that they had much contacts with the founders of the organization, period. And they changed all of their actual practices consistently. They went from this Scientology group, which they couldn't get going, and they were from Britain, by the way. These are all Londoners, and so that's what happened there. They then went to the United States and become this very dark Christian group wearing these, robes are not satanic garb. I mean, when you think of a robe, you think of monks wearing these black robes and everything else. They did wear these. They had regular Christian crosses, and they had a serpent in the center. And it was the serpent they consider, which some Gnostic groups consider the wise one, bringing knowledge to the ignorant, who only had one side to look at. And this then caused conflict. So it was the serpent who was the bringer of light, the Lucifer aspect, to bring them to a higher level, which basic religion doesn't. Basic religion, you're a slave and you do what they tell you to do. Now, this is the general concept. So all of that, they never used any kind. None of the members of the church at the beginning or through its entire practice ever practiced what would be considered witchcraft and magic. None of that was done. I can't find a single reference to a pentagram, but a pentagram, which they never wore, never had rings, and I've heard people state that before. They never used that symbol from what I can find. Looking at their memorabilia and other things, it's their particular logos. They invented their own stuff. They had their cross with the serpent in it. They had symbols that they showed. So none of this was traditionally or using from some sort of magical witchcraft practice. They didn't do that. And nobody within the actual organization, which was stated by Timothy Wiley, stated that they had any background in those kind of practices. I don't think they did. That was not their thing. I don't see any of it. I don't see any of it anywhere. Satanic practices and symbols are pretty simplistic. It's an upside down cross. It's a question mark. There isn't that many. And as usual, they're stealing all this. It's all the reverse of Christianity. Anton LaVey stole a pentagram and put a Baphomet head in there, which was stolen by another practitioner, a defrocked priest. What was it, Epis Levi or whatever his name was, who wrote an occult book on this stuff, or his version of it. None of that has any value. So it's all taken and so, and the pentagram is not necessarily, a pentagram goes back to Babylonia. It's not an occult symbol. I mean, it's not a witchcraft magical symbol. It goes way back to the older societies who use that, and it is a symbol that even the Christians use. So the pentagram itself, which was taken by Satanists and then put upside down to meaning the control of the elements, is a bogus symbol as well. There's nothing occult about that. That comes from basically, goes back to Christianity again. But they didn't use any of that. I can't find any of that in their memorabilia list, and there's quite a bit on. It's amazing how this organization has stayed alive for 50 years with their philosophy and their wildness. Now, if there were guys that stand on the street corner in ties and shirts and handing out pamphlets, you remember that? We've all ran into hundreds of people like that. You remember a single one of them? I don't remember a single one of them gave me a little pamphlet. I probably would have remembered if they were wearing a black robe with a cross with a red serpent in the center of it. Now, the crosses were never inverted. I probably remembered them. And if they had a big German Shepherd dog, I'd probably remember them twice. You see how that's called marketing. Now, there is some slight question of the amount or the different processed church little cells they may have had. And did they have a cell, which has been stated in other books, that the members were unaware that there were so many little different, quote, cells, which I kind of find interesting that they weren't aware of this. People were brought in from other areas to do all this. And what does that actually mean? Well, it means that there's private groups under Marianne that were doing her will. Now, from what we can see, Marianne was a very unstable, strange woman who had no business background, no anything. What's interesting is what seemed to accumulate in the amount of wealth they had, which of course she kept to herself, as did Grimston. Very little to none of it went to anybody else. I mean, they wouldn't even pay for medical care for their children in Chicago. They wouldn't pay for food. They wouldn't put people there of any worth to take care of the children, even though it started out that the woman who took over, and she talks about this in a chapter of the book written by Timothy Wiley, which is a very interesting book because they have chapters by many different people in it. So it's not just him stating his jive. Other people were stated there. Their photographs are in that book, and they have identified themselves. Now, the bottom line is that that book states she took over, so they finally set somebody in there to take over for the children who were taken care of poorly. But there was a lack of everything there, and she herself had a baby, and they denied her medical coverage until the very end. Well, you join a place, you have to take care of them. That's part of it. So this is the kind of thing. But they ultimately did pay for the medical care and whatever went with that. But there wasn't any money while they were living in the lap of luxury. Now, this is not something that we can question of whether it's evil or not. It is evil. And it's nothing generally satanic in nature. It's evil generally. The Christian church are notorious for their evil acts to everyone while they preach love and go out and help people. Supposedly, it ain't much, and feeding people twice a year don't fill their bellies. They are not really making an impact. We have churches now for over 2,000 years of Christian. They have tons of money, yet where is the outreach? We have millions and millions of people on the street, and while some of the churches help with that, I know there was a homeless center run by a priest where I used to live who did a lot of good work. It seems to be a drop in the bucket of what needs to be done, and where is the support there? But this is not a question. Not taking care of and abusing children, not having enough food, people having babies with no medical care whatsoever, while you're living in a mansion eating caviar and drinking champagne is downright evil. So typically Christian evil. He wants to blame everybody else. So the bottom line is that there's a lot of questions here. Now, if a person can do that and be that neglectful and that alienated from the taking care of what's considered the innocence, how much more of a stretch is it that they may have been going out in a vengeful manner and killing people or working with other people? Now, I really would like to know what the benefit of that would be. There's talk about this stuff, and, they talk about Manson, who wanted to start he didn't want to start a race riot. He was trying to cover up for the murders there by trying to blame it on somebody else. It had nothing to do with that. And this is another misunderstanding of what happened there. So what is the bottom line with this organization and so forth is still unknown. Now, the founder has been dead. I believe Mary Ann's been dead since 2005. You're talking about almost 20 years ago. So we know nothing from it. De Grimston, apparently nobody contacts this guy, or he doesn't want contact. I have no idea. We do have a certain amount of literature now left from Timothy Wiley, who has kind of set out what the church did, and I tend to believe that. I mean, these organizations go up and down. If you're a smart people and you're able to go on the street and beg, they had coffee shops and all the things that went with them, they were able to make some good money. It's also very strange of why this organization has so much money and even did have so much money, even though their history written by the people involved in it was all about not having money and not being able to have the funds to do what they want. Yet, on the other hand, they seems to be properties. They're buying stuff. They're losing lots of money, and then they come back, and they seem to have a lot of money. This organization turned into the largest privately owned animal sanctuary maybe in the world, and has lots and lots of money. You're talking about an organization that's generating tens of millions of dollars, maybe hundreds of millions if you look at some of their financials. But they have a super income. And being a nonprofit, they have to account for every penny of that, and it's public, and it is actually put there. So what do we make of all this? Well, it's very confusing. And why has this organization stayed alive? Why do people care about it? Why are there books written? Well, this is all because of Maury Terry. Maury Terry, who wrote the Ultimate Evil, the Sum of Sam book, blamed everything on them for doing everything, and that they were able. And I listened to even a interview of him on radio that he did, and ultimately he came out to blame them. And it's an easy blame, and I think there's a complicated issue here, which I'm not going to go into on this particular book here, but that's who's done it. Now, here is an actual book from a guy who is involved with it, who doesn't have an axe to grind. I think if you were really abused and you were that hurt, you would be writing a tell-all. You would be talking about this. Yet, he is not doing that. He feels that this was not a good place. He didn't want to be there. He didn't like the way he was treated. There were minor abuse from what I can see and what's written here, and that's his story. And he doesn't like their philosophy. He doesn't like the fact that he didn't really have a mother and dad right there for him. And of course, then he easily found another cult, the Mormon Church, who has very cult-like practices. And to go into. So that's what he's been doing and his objective to it. I think if you were abused as horribly as there has been people have alleged, that this would be a very nasty book talking about people in another way. But it really isn't. It's about living in a monastery of uncomfort and disconnection between the people there, who were cold and unloving, and that in itself. And I heard the same thing from people who grew up in monasteries and other things, including my own grandmother, who grew up in an Italian run by nuns. And there was all sorts of violent abuse there. They were sexually screwed up. They bathed you with clothes on. This is the kind of mental case stuff that was done back in these. Nothing new. That would be a horrific book for people to find out what the inner workings of a real Christian Catholic order was. So I don't see anything here, and I'm a little tired of the Process Church being attacked because they were kind of Hollywood. And they did a good job at it, and that's how they survived. Now, what are all these little bits and pieces I certainly like to put together? I'd like to know what this transition to this animal sanctuary that now has tens of millions of dollars is all about. How did that happen? Are they doing good work? Is this a giant front? Well, everything is possible. People have alleged that this animal sanctuary is just a front for people to get their animals that they can sacrifice. Well, I doubt that. And I doubt that dog lovers like Marianne was out there sacrificing animals. The fact that in the Son of Sam case, and particularly Untermeyer Park, they found, and I'm not sure how many they found, particularly German Shepherd dogs that had their heads cut off and were ritually sacrificed. Well, I'm not sure how many of them were. I don't believe any of that said. How many was there? Were they really only German Shepherds? Was this, that? And why German Shepherds? Why was that done? We just don't know. The fact that they had German Shepherds means very little. It's unlikely that you raise animals and then kill them, even though that's what farmers do. That's what ranchers do. But there's a certain distance that ranchers have between themselves and their animals, which you don't generally have with dogs who are part of your family. So all of this doesn't add up. And of course, he doesn't mention any of this is going on. He mentions absolutely nothing except this being a cold, loveless, isolated organization that did things to survive that he didn't like. And of course, he was disconnected from everyone. So this is a personal story of a guy coming of age. There's kind of an intertwined love story in this. There's all sorts of other things that are there. It's hard to really get through books like this. And I don't like novelizations in general because you can twist and turn these things way out of boundaries to make things mold them into what you desire instead of stating facts. Because when you state facts, somebody can come up and say, well, that's not true. But when it's a novel, it is. But there are reasons for all this. Life isn't as simple as it appears. And few people are out there doing the great work in terms of being honest, seeking gnosis and truth. And certainly these kind of organizations that are Gnostic in their beliefs, meaning that we live in hell, everything is terrible, the physical is bad, certainly are not necessarily in any way seeking truth. That's kind of a common sense looking at the world around you. But does that mean that this is a organization seeking truth? Well, their writings are very interesting, and de Grimston and his mankind is the devil really sums up life in a few paragraphs, which I 100% agree with. But we are still out in a reality here of what's going on. So this is not going to shed any light on what was going on there. There's only a mixing of what they actually did day to day, but it shows you what they were into, what they were doing, etc. And I think that gives you a little bit, if you're a fervent researcher in this area, is there? I haven't met one of them except myself. They're not reading all this. He's got 2 books. You'll read this with a fine-tooth comb and find out what you can pick apart from it and connect to what your other knowledge is. But I frankly doubt very many people have done that. But this is certainly an interesting person. Several people have come forward. There are lots of people connected to this organization that are still out there and alive. And certainly Timothy Wiley was able to connect with some of them. Of course, being a member, I guess he had better access to these people. But as Grimston is still alive, he's 86, he's living in Sarasota, Florida. Has anybody tried to contact him? He's not hiding overly well. So, matter of fact, one researcher on this particular organization found out that he was living in Staten Island, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. He only has moved recently and just got his name out of the phone book. So what is going on here? And there's so many misstatements done by people in the Son of Sam research area, including all the police who totally absurd and outrageous statements that are totally and completely incorrect. So, I mean, it's just the extent of these misstatements are shocking, including that de Grimston, the ex-husband who she threw out of the organization, was working at the actual sanctuary for animals. Well, this isn't true. She was remarried to Dupree, and he hadn't, I don't know if he's ever been there, but he was not involved in the sanctuary organization whatsoever. This was all started by her and her new husband, and they found out that the best thing to raise money for is animals. And, you know, that's true. It's much easier to raise money for animals. People love giving money to help animals. The best thing you can do if you're ever on the street trying to beg is have a little animal with you, because you're going to get lots more money. That's how it works, because people don't care about humans. They care about animals. This is one of the strange things of this reality. So we all look at this to understand what's going on and trying to pick these things apart. So if you're a real researcher, you should read this. Go through it with a fine-tooth comb and see if you can find any connections. As I said, the connections I found is that there were people within the church who were drug addicts and doing criminal activities to support their drug addict. Now, how far did that go into what? To think that an organization like this could have organized murderers that work, I don't believe that for a second, at least not this branch. Not with a bunch of kids, not with Timothy Wiley and his group, who are basically people seeking alternatives, kind of a little nut jobs. They're all nut jobs. And of course, I see this with a lot of people. Certainly this is not a cult of people who are murdering and who have knowledge of any of these type of things. Now, can there be a branch, particularly if you have money, that somehow did this for some bizarre reason? Or were they even paid to do this? But what was the point of the Son of Sam? What was the point of these murders? Now, Manson was a lack of payment for drugs, plain and simple. That's what that was all about. The processed church is a red herring. The theories by Maury Terry are not only bogus, and I believe directly designed through pressure, payoffs, and other things that I allege to push everything on an organization that's going to lead you down a dry hole, while the active participants in this all seem to be out there. Certainly the police know about them. They're connected in all the wealthy areas there. Riverdale seems to be a big area where a lot of these people were at, ironically, since investigators seem to be from there. So the whole idea is all these things are very strange of what's going on, and there is a lot of disinformation and misinformation that's deliberately put out there, which I think is happening to this very day. And the investigators into all, quote, occult, satanic murders and organizations have no background in that field of study whatsoever, and they're not interested in talking to people that do, because after all, they are the idiots. And when you talk to an expert, it makes you look like an idiot. So they make all sorts of misstatements and all sorts of things that you have to really wonder if they're just not out and out lies and they're being manipulated and being paid off, which is what I think happened to Maury Terry, who basically put together a book that had no answer, and he wanted to make money on it. And the only way he could do it was to tie in the statements made by a known psychopathic mental case of David Berkowitz, to think that anything that he tells us has any value whatsoever. And whether what was out there and whether there were multiple shooters and whether they were tied to satanic cults, well, this is going on today and people don't get it. But mostly what's happening, and was probably happening back then, is that these aren't Satanists. They are murdering criminals that happen to use Satanism for their own desires. That's what it really comes down to. And we do have to understand that it has absolutely nothing to do with what is called occultism, witchcraft, sorcery, magic, etc. It has nothing to do with Satanism or any of their practices, regardless of what they steal and state. But certainly this organization didn't do any of that, and most satanic organizations don't do that as well. It's just all nonsense that's out there. So we need to, if we're going to find answers to this, we need to make sure that we're looking in the right direction. And thanks to the really horrible journalism, we're talking about National Enquirer level journalism that Maury Terry put out, we now have a bunch of people looking in that direction who are completely and totally ignorant, know nothing about anything, and particularly that case, and it is now leading them down paths that make no sense. And there really is nobody in the Process Church anyway. They're all gone. You can go back to the animal sanctuary. And why hasn't people done that? The misstatements about that sanctuary is appalling and made by actual police officers who don't do anything to begin with. So, what is in here? If you're a researcher, read the books and look between the lines like I did. As I said, there is a certain reality here that there was certain activities going on that link this. What does all that mean? I'm not sure. If we go by the fact that there's problems with people taking drugs, well, that's pretty much everybody in society. So it doesn't make any sense. Are these the typical strange, bizarre cults, which I've read about 100 times? Yes, they are. And this is a carbon copy of all of these cults, from David Koresh to the People's Temple to Heaven's Gate. It's all the same thing, and all these people are abused and kept under control and told to do things, and it basically is a horrific life. Nobody seems very happy. You have to wonder why these cults work at all. So it's all very strange in the bigger picture, but this is so typical about any organization. We've seen the kind of talk about, if you want to investigate sexual abuse and other things, people ought to be investigating the different churches, and particularly the Catholic Church, who it's pandemic their problems with that. So you're trying to chase down something 50 years ago because it's got a sexy thing to it. Oh, these were Satanists. Ooh, and they were murdering. Nonsense. Look at all the, I believe that the Vatican has huge amounts of money in arms companies in the stock market, weapons manufacturing companies. So this is what's been alleged against them. So it goes on and on with all these things, and we need to move away from this. Let's find some facts here. And I'm not sure, there's certainly nothing that can be found out about this church whatsoever. Nobody seems to be going into investigating the modern group, which has been operating for 20, 30 years now, whose original founder is now dead. So what is going on here? Well, absolutely nothing. This is really mental masturbation at its worst.